Hello, welcome to episode 3 of Planet and the People. If you are tuning into this podcast for the first time, it is a podcast about climate change. But today I wanted to specifically explore a subject that is very close to all of our hearts. This is an episode that I really wanted to do because we can all relate in various different ways to the subjects of pandemics because we have been living it in varying degrees of hell for the last year and a bit. This is not an episode, I hasten to add, about COVID-19. We've all had quite a lot of discussion around that. Of course, it's not completely ignored. We do talk about COVID-19, but this is generally an episode about pandemics as a whole and the emergence of pandemics and how they correlate with environmental breakdown, which is a topic that I don't think is widely discussed. I stumbled across it on a few articles a while ago, and it's briefly mentioned in David Attenborough's documentary Extinction the Facts, which if you haven't watched that, I would strongly recommend it. It's on iPlayer. But when talking about climate change, we often talk about deforestation, we talk about pollutants, water pollutants, biodiversity loss, and how they all contribute to rising temperatures and global warming. But we don't really often talk about how they also contribute to a rise in new pathogens and new diseases that can lead to global pandemics like the one we've been having. All a bundle of laughs. So I wanted to do an episode about that because I feel that the more we understand that correlation and the more we can bring that centre stage in our discussion about COVID-19, the more it might push us to think, you know what, I really don't want this to be a regular occurrence and I'm going to pull my finger out. So to help me unwrap that big, overwhelming topic, I spoke to Dr. David Redding, who is a specialist in zoonotic diseases, and Dr. Peter Jones, who is a reader in environmental governance, among many other specialties. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to my past self and Dr. David Redding and Dr. Peter Jones. Thank you, Dr. Peter Jones and Dr. David Redding, for joining me today. First of all, I'd like to ask a little bit about you. I'll start with you, David. Tell me a little bit about yourself and your work and what do you do?
Yes, I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Zoology at the Zoological Society of London. And most of my work currently concentrates on understanding how global change processes such as climate change, land use change, and sort of patterns of human demographic and behavioural change, how those impact the set of diseases that we catch generally from wild animals. So thinking about how wild animals are moving and interacting with people and how, at a large scale, how broad changes are impacting how we contact and get diseases from these animals.
Mm. And Peter, tell me a bit about you. You've never met in life, have you, the two of you? No.
No, we haven't. No, we haven't.
All right. Well, Peter, tell me a bit about yourself.
I've been at University College London since 1997. I focus on research, broadly speaking, on environmental governance issues. And the best way of summarising that is probably I'm particularly interested in how we can combine different governance approaches, the role of the state, the role of people, the role of markets, etc. How we can combine these different sorts of governance to achieve strategic societal objectives. Most of my research focuses on case studies in marine protected areas, marine spatial planning, and to a degree fisheries management because it's very closely related. But I also discuss and analyse broader environmental governance issues, and certainly this pandemic has given me plenty to think and write about.
Plenty to work with. David, I'll start by asking you a question just about human disease. You work a lot with human disease, biodiversity, environmental change, and zootonic diseases. Is that right? Zootonic diseases, zootoses?
zoonotic diseases or zoonoses.
Oh, okay.
So there's quite a few similar words. A zoonotic disease is one which is principally caught from other sort of large animals with backbones. It's a slightly arbitrary definition, but we also have vector-borne diseases, which are ones that are swapped between people and people by biting arthropods such as mosquitoes, or swapped from animals to people by those same sort of arthropods. So we've got zoonotic diseases and vector-borne diseases, both of which have a sort of can have a key kind of wild animal element to it that are impacted by lots of things like, climate change and land use change.
So could you describe some recent diseases and pandemics and outbreaks? I suppose this might be one of them. That is a zoonotic disease or a zootoses that is directly linked to wildlife.
So, one of the things to note is that all organisms are passing sort of pathogens to each other all the time. It's an ongoing process that happens throughout known biodiversity. So there's nothing unusual about pathogens being swapped. What happens is that very occasionally those pathogens that come from one species, whether it's animals to people or people to animals, or between plants, whatever, every now and again a pathogen gets swapped that's suited to spreading within that population. So it's a new pathogen, it's come from another species, but very rarely those pathogens can then spread within that new species really effectively. We've got a good example is the original Sars outbreak in 2003, which happened in Southeast Asia and spread between a couple of, maybe sort of 100,000 odd people. We don't really know how far it spread, but it was contained. So that's likely to spill over from a horseshoe bat to people.
A horseshoe bat?
A horseshoe bat. So it's a small bat that lives often in sort of caves where they roost, and then they'll come out and eat moths and mosquitoes and things. But we have horseshoe bats within that genus throughout Europe and Asia. So the other types of horseshoe bats. So this one is the Chinese horseshoe bat.
And that was SARS.
So that was SARS. So now we've got a very close relative to that, which is SARS-CoV-2, which is come from a similar source. But other well-known examples are Ebola. So Ebola is able to spill over from. We're not 100% sure what the actual host where it exists most of the time, but we know that it's found in large bats, fruit bats, and also in great apes, and in these little sort of antelope things called duikers. And so that virus is capable of spilling over into people and then spreading widely. The other really well-known example is the influenza A virus, which happens every year. It changes its code inside it, and every year it then spreads. And every now and again it gets a very different combination of its nucleotides, and then it spreads very, very widely. And that's what we think of as a pandemic flu. So there's lots of examples, but most spillovers that happen either cause limited disease within a single person, or they don't cause any disease at all. So thinking things like Ebola, we've got a coronavirus called MERS that spills over occasionally in the Middle East. So, there's probably 400 or 500 well-known zoonotic diseases that spill over from wild animals. Sorry, Peter, did you want to say something?
Yeah. I just want to add the probably one of the most historically significant pandemics on record, which was the Spanish flu in 1918. That was almost certainly avian in origin. It crossed over between wild birds and domestic birds, and then possibly infected humans via pigs. There's often this uneasy relationship between domestic animals and wild animals. That's quite an important vector link. So yeah, just as a footnote to David's run through the examples, let's not forget the biggest historic example of Spanish flu, because that was a zoonotic that was had, as we know, devastating international consequences.
Would you both say that Spanish flu and also COVID-19 could be described as an ecological event, that is because of environmental breakdown?
broadly speaking, you could consider them as ecological events because we have an ecosystem of humans, zoonotic viruses, and animal vectors, animal and bird vectors. So yes, we can consider the pandemic as an ecological phenomenon, which at its root is our increasingly close and uneasy relationship with wildlife. It's, if you like, symptomatic of the problems of our uneasy relationship with wildlife.
Would you say it's actually, first of all, I'm going to ask you, both of you, because there are lots of theories going around, and I'm not sure. I mean, I was speaking to someone yesterday who said, yes, no, this is how it started. Do we actually know exactly where the COVID-19 pandemic started?
I think anyone who professes to know precisely what happened is likely to be falsely sure of that, because it's one of those things where it's very difficult to reconstruct the past with these very specific events that happened. So, we can sort of say, well, look, let's look at the how it's evolved. Let's compare the structure of, say, some of the proteins to ones that are found in other animals. Oh, this one looks quite similar to this one that's found. But that doesn't mean that we know what the exact process was. So I think there's lots of floating theories. They'll have a probability associated with them. But I think maybe we'll never know. It could well be that, that it's built over from a bat to a person directly, and then that person moved to the city. So this could have happened in rural areas. The person moved, and then there was some kind of spreading and some kind of recombination type events that happened within the market area or an area around that market that may well have been important. But you can just imagine that it's also likely to muddy the water a lot when it's starting to swap between different people. We don't really know how old it is. We don't really know where it came from. And so I think we have to be really cautious about anybody suggesting they know. Having said that, spillovers happen all the time. And you can go to areas where people interact with horseshoe bats and you'll see that they have antibodies against similar coronaviruses. So there's no mysterious origin.
So just to follow that, would you say, the wildlife markets, that's been given a lot of the blame. Peter, did you have something to say about the wildlife markets?
Yeah, I completely agree with David. We'll never be able to go back in time and follow the virus through a specific pathway. But we can say, I think, with considerable certainty, let's say sufficient certainty, that the close interactions between wild species, meat for human consumption, and humans, that close proximity in wet markets was an arena for that initial transmission. I think that is more than just a plausible theory now. Some conspiracy theorists are arguing that it came out from a specific lab, but that's just a conspiracy theory.
Oh yeah, I wanted to ask you that actually. Okay. What are your thoughts on the lab theory, both of you?
I think David's the expert here, but it would seem to me that it's about as plausible as climate change not being an issue. It's a convenient theory. I've come up with this view recently that these conspiracy theories, I used to be quite aggressive towards them and they used to make me cross. I now actually just see them as a symptom of people's inability to deal with the magnitude of the problem. It's a more empathetic way of understanding why people indulge in these conspiracy theories. So it would probably be nice to believe that the virus was bred by human agency. Human agency was involved, but I think it's actually a more inadvertent human agency. It's these, frankly, both inhumane and extremely unhygienic wet markets that we have to consider as the cause of the virus rather than some germ warfare attempt.
And David, what about you? What do you say if people say, "Oh, I think it was definitely made in a lab"?
I think science is the search for sort of objective knowledge, and part of that is this idea that the simplest, most plausible explanation is your working version of the truth. So it's just unnecessary. It is completely unnecessary as an explanation. We know spillovers happen all the time. We know that coronaviruses spill over to people all the time. Why do you need this extra thing? All it means is that you could blame it on something, you could potentially stop it. But we can't stop it. It's a tidal wave of pathogens or microorganisms, I should say. is happening all the time. People are continually interacting with wildlife and domestic animals and are continually swapping these pathogens. So we just don't need it as an explanation. But just to go back a little bit, all diseases have some kind of zoonotic, some animal-borne origin. We look at measles; that's one of the biggest impacting diseases in history. The number of cases is going to dwarf probably the number of cases of COVID we've seen recently, because we're talking hundreds of millions of cases a year. And that's spilt over from probably domestic animals, which, probably got it from some other animals, in the year about 1,000. And that was during a time of great land use change, great change in terms of in Europe, we were cutting down forests and interacting with wildlife, and we were going out and putting our animals out grazing, and they were interacting with wildlife. So we've accrued these diseases, these human diseases, from animal sources. But, that's probably as a result of historical sort of invasion into wild habitats. So this is just a snapshot in time, but everything that we've got is just a sort of echo of all of these interactions we've had with wildlife in the past.
So would you actually say every pandemic that we've had in history, going back to things like the plague, the Black Death, I mean, that came from rats, would that be to do with our relationship with nature, our globalization essentially, and invading other species' habitats?
Yeah, I mean, we're living in an ecosystem. We're an integral part of it. We rely on it, and it's kind of bizarre that we don't value it enough. We don't, they spent £12 billion, just the US, on a vaccination program. There's been a huge amount of effort to try and deal with what is seen as an emergency event. But all the other emergency events to do with the way that we're degrading the ecosystem, we're degrading air, so it's difficult to breathe. We're altering the climate such that we're making it hard for people to live in places. That's not seen as in the same urgency as this. So really, it's just an ongoing example of how people are impacting the ecosystem that we are integrally part of. And therefore, yes, I do think that, our historic patterns of the way we've interacted with wildlife and the way our domesticated animals have interacted with wildlife, are responsible for all of the illness, vast majority of illness.
Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I completely agree with David. I mean, broadly speaking, we used to, in environmental management and environmental moral philosophy circles, we used to talk about, whether we were conserving nature for nature's sake or for our sake, very broadly speaking. And what this pandemic has shown us is that there is no either or. If we impinge into ecosystems, if we degrade natural habitats and grow foods in what were natural habitats and move humans into what were natural habitats, and we take species out of natural habitats and put them onto markets in the vicinity of food and in the vicinity of humans, that ultimately the destruction of wildlife is potentially going to lead to pandemic crises like this, potentially even more severe and untreatable pandemics. So this is a perfect illustration to me of it isn't an either or situation. We're conserving nature both for the well-being of nature and to ensure our well-being. And I think if there's one thing that one lesson that we've learned from the pandemic, it is that.
I want to ask you a little bit more about that in a bit, about sort of our relationship with nature and what the dialogue is there, because it does seem that that's not really prominent in the dialogue about this. But before that, I want to go into a bit of detail about the root causes of pandemics. Land use. You both mentioned land use a few times. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Maybe David, talk a bit more about kind of land use and why land use change has resulted in things like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite complicated, the processes behind it, because if we have a very large, very, very diverse ecosystem that say you go into a pristine rainforest, you've got thousands of species of which they're going to have all their own set of microorganisms that have evolved with them, and you're going to have a really high number potentially of microorganisms to interact with, and then one of those might be hugely pathogenic and spread around the world. So you've kind of got this idea that you could imagine that actually getting rid of stuff would be a good way of stopping disease. But actually, it doesn't really seem like that's the case, because what happens is that we go into an area that's say a forest, and we start to hunt in there, and we start using bits of it for agriculture, for growing. And as we invade it more and more, it's, a couple of people in a rainforest living fairly sustainably. It's fairly small kind of human animal interface. It just is quite small, and the chances of meeting these kind of scary pathogens is just pretty low. But as we start using it more, as we invade it more, we increase the kind of total interface that we have between people and animals. And if you think about domestic animals, are really just an extension of our own immune systems, really, because people interact with them so much. They'll have them in the houses in many cultures, or they'll be spending time with them all the time and interacting with them. That when you start sending them out into areas and grazing and turning it more into this more sort of human-dominated landscape, if they catch something, you're likely to then be exposed to it in very high numbers. And example of things like Nipah virus in Southeast Asia, that spreads to pigs, and then from anyone who's working in the pig farms, then exposed to huge amounts of the Nipah virus. So then that spills over into people. So as we start invading it, as we start using that landscape, we end up with this much larger interface between wild animals and their pathogens and people. And interestingly, some of the work that I've done recently has shown that the animal communities that we find in more human-dominated landscapes are more likely to be those that carry diseases. So you can kind of think about it as some of the larger-bodied animals that we, say we remove things like carnivores, we remove things like, elephants, rhinos, those sort of things. We don't tend to get many diseases from those. You can get diseases from them, but when you think about what's left, you end up with rodents and passerine birds, small perching birds, and bats are one of the things that are left in fairly degraded systems, and those have a higher proportion of those species carry disease. So we end up kind of selecting animal communities that are more effective at passing on disease to ourselves inadvertently.
So it's not the same as if you sort of walk in, if you're an explorer who walks into the jungle and goes for a trek and comes out again, is there a chance that person might come out and start a world global pandemic?
There is, but it's tiny. If you think about it, the people who are farming are tens, hundreds of millions of people who go out into fields every day and interact with species. And if you've got a degraded system with mainly just rodents left in it, then the species they're going to interact with and the ones that can reach high numbers in fields, things like, so Mastomis natalensis is the most common agricultural pest species in sub-Saharan Africa, and that carries a huge number of diseases. So leptospirosis, and it carries Lassa fever in West Africa, which is a very high burden disease. And you're talking, the interface there is hundreds of millions of people interacting with many, many millions of animals. So the contacts there are so dwarf any small tribes in jungles or explorers going into jungles. It's just a numbers game.
This is probably a good point to mention the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Very few people have heard of IPBES, as it's routinely referred to, but it's the equivalent of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC has been around for years. The IPBES panel has only been around in the last few years, and they've recently produced a report on pandemics. And they have found through their deliberations and studies that human ecological disruption and unsustainable consumption is the driver behind pandemic risk. That land use change, agricultural expansion, and urbanization have caused more than 30% of emerging disease events, and that the trade in and consumption of wildlife is a major important risk for future pandemics. And I think one of the key arguments that they make is that our approach so far has been reactive. We're not learning the lessons from past pandemics. Rather than trying to be reactive, what I call end of pipe solutions, such as isolation measures and and vaccines. And of course, all the terrible economic and social costs that come along with those measures. We really need to stop being reactive now and start to think about how we can recognize that our encroachment into ecosystems and our exploitative relationship with non-human species is the source of these pandemics. And I think that's one. It's a very clear message that comes out from this UN advisory panel that we need to start thinking about policies to reduce the role of land use change.
That's actually something I was going to ask about, because a question for both of you. What is the likelihood of this happening again?
100%.
100%. And do you think that the world will start looking more at preventative measures rather than reactive? Do you think that we might learn from this? Because one of the things I often think about, climate change is a major worry and everything that we've got, and maybe this pandemic will force people to wake up and make sure that this doesn't happen again. But the dialogue at the moment is all about the vaccine. The dialogue is all about isolation. Let's get back to normal, spend money, and the economy will be fine. What is the dialogue? Are people talking about the actual root causes on a policy level, I suppose?
Yeah, I would say there is increasing interest in those. I think one of the things we have to worry about is this desperation to return to normal, because returning to normal and returning to business as usual is a continuation of our sleepwalking into disaster kind of mode that we seem to want to get back to so desperately. And so, looking at our ability to meet, for instance, climate, our climate commitments, we'd need to see a reduction in movement and use of carbon-based sort of fuels, similar to what we saw during the first lockdown. We need to see that every year in order to get back to that. But what is it going to take? We can say lots of advice about, this is a bad situation, but we need to not be desperate to return to normal. We need to return to something sustainable. That's what we need to move. We need to see that. And I don't see that as an overriding aim.
No, it definitely doesn't seem to be what everyone's talking about. I just wonder whether what we're going through right now, the year we've had, people will start to actually think, okay, this is real.
Like a lot of people that do research on environmental issues and our response to them and whether that response is adequate, it's very easy to go through quite long periods of pessimism that border on depression. Depression in this field is recognised as an increasing issue. But I've managed to turn it around in the last few months, because I like to think more positively that this is a moment in history. It might be a decade, but it's a moment in history when potentially there could be like some great awakening. When I look at video footage of the fires in California and the fires in Australia, and orangutans hanging on to lorries that are taking logs out of their habitat, we start to see the beginnings of this growing public awareness that our uneasy relationship with nature is backfiring on us. That climate change is not a risk that some so-called experts are predicting. It's here and it's now and it's manifest and it's going to get worse. When we see those images alongside the disruption that everybody's experiencing with COVID and the risks to our own health, to our own mortality, then I like to try and be more optimistic and positive and say, well, this is a moment when we could have a great awakening. In musical nomenclature, there's a pause known as a fermata, or rather poetically as a corona. So a corona in musical nomenclature is a pause which should be held for as long as the conductor indicates. And I like to think that the present pandemic lockdown could be considered as nature as conductor, providing for a grand pause in our societal trajectory towards overexploitation and environmental degradation, so that we can reconsider the impacts of human activities. So I think this coincidence of these increasingly graphic and disturbing images of the impacts of climate change and the impacts of biodiversity loss, both of which they're featuring very strongly at the moment. David Attenborough's superb extinction program really knocks some people flat. And maybe whilst we're all at home, isolated and thinking and talking about what caused this and how we can head it off, I try and be more positive. It's a grand pause. It's a corona from which we can learn.
Have you got anything to add to that, David?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's got to be led in some way by government. You know, we need to put pressure on higher organisational levels to start pushing, because otherwise your convenience is the king. And I think that's one of the things that we suffer from is the convenience of exploitation of, you know, resources and nature. So I think I'd love to be as optimistic. I'm hoping to reach that point. But I do worry about this push for return to normal, because the normal isn't serving us.
Has there been, from your side of the fence, an international effort to really look at the root causes of this pandemic? I mean, because this year has seen governments worldwide really listening to science, or one side of science anyway, about how to tackle this pandemic. But has there been... So there has been an investigation into the root causes of it, but would you say that governments are focusing on it and prioritizing it, or do you think they will?
There isn't a single root cause. That's the problem. This is a worldwide global phenomenon of the way that we're interacting with nature. And so swine flu, which could have been much more pathogenic than it was, you know, we think that appeared in Mexico. We've got Ebola, which, you know, none of these viruses are static. These are continually moving targets in terms of the nucleotides that code for them. They're changing all the time. So Ebola isn't going to be the same Ebola virus in a few decades. You know, they're a complicated chance event in this huge chaotic set of interactions. What we need to do is we need to tone down our risk as much as we can. We need to tamp it down throughout the world. What we need to do is say, how are we interacting with the world, and how can we respond to that? So I worked with a group putting together a policy brief about supply chains. So as a country, say, that's pretty much destroyed all its wildlife, like the UK, you know, if you're dealing with countries where they're interacting a lot with their wildlife, we need to be sure that the products we're buying, if that's the main way that we're interacting with this kind of wild animal human interface, are ones that don't promote further destruction and further invasion into habitats. So we can buy products where, you know, come from existing farmlands, say if we're buying soya or cocoa or whatever, you know, that's one single route where we can try and reduce the impact. But if we just blindly say, oh, we'll buy anything, then there's no reason for people not to just chop down more areas if it's slightly more profitable. Things like thinking about our supply chains, thinking about how development is going to happen from this point onwards. We can't be blind to it anymore. We've just been so indifferent that it's just happened at random, and possibly, as Peter was saying, in the most efficient way we could get to start spilling these pathogens over to people.
And I think perhaps being less optimistic now, but more realistic.
Oh dear.
The extreme risks posed by the wildlife trade for future coronavirus outbreaks were warned of as a time bomb over 10 years ago. Scientists identified the link between avian influenza, HN51, in 1996. And so over 10 years ago, they specifically warned that wet markets in southern China and more widely in Southeast Asia were a time bomb. The Chinese government at the time of the avian influenza outbreak in 1996 closed the wet markets, and a year later they reopened them. The wet markets that almost certainly were at least a vector in this COVID-19 pandemic, if not the source of the pandemic. Those markets were shut for a few weeks during the severe Chinese lockdown, but those markets are opened again. So that would suggest that the answer to your question, Tom, is that no, we're not learning from it. That very market that was probably the source of this virus is open again and is potentially a vector and transmission point for the next zoonotic virus outbreak.
Are things like that? I mean, are international governments, the UN, etc., are there ways of trying to put pressure on banning markets like that, considering the repercussions that we've seen all year?
You can't ban them overnight.
No.
The Chinese government, and I think it is, I'm prepared to single out the Chinese government here. The Chinese government had the opportunity over 10 years ago to start phasing out those markets. You can't close them overnight. You're just driving the trade underground. You've got to start influencing people's norms and values so that they recognize that this isn't a traditional practice. This isn't a traditional market. It's a highly modern, globalized, consumer demand-driven market. It's an international trade. So there was a tremendous opportunity to address that over 10 years ago, and the Chinese government missed it. But it should be a gradual process of changing people's values and norms. You can't ban it overnight. The United Nations cannot issue an edict saying these markets are banned. That's just not consistent with international law. But through the outputs of these sorts of scientific reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, we can start to use the influence through the UN mechanisms, including political pressure to encourage the Chinese government to start phasing out these wet markets and shut down the international wildlife trade. But this is going to take at least 10 to 20 years.
Can I just add there that I do think that the wildlife interface happens throughout the world, but I would like to say that the Western obsession with beef has had a huge impact on the world in terms of climate change. By far and away, it's the single biggest consumer thing that you can do that impacts climate change. So I think if we're asking China and sensibly to start restricting the way animals interact, we need to stop with our own damaging food practices as well.
I want to ask you both, actually, as a sort of rounding things up. What would you like to see happen now? I suppose you've already answered this in a way, but what would you like to see happen now to try and make sure this doesn't happen on this level again?
Well, I think one of the things, and I mean this seems maybe slightly self-serving, is more research, but research that understands the complexity of the situation and isn't siloed into public health, into ecology, into pollution, or whatever it is. So, examples of how can we meet the food needs of areas that are undergoing large amounts of population change at the same time as not impacting the local, natural systems that are there. So you've got to think in a more holistic way. Can we design landscapes that have predators in them that can keep down high levels of rodents? Something like that, where we're using the natural control systems. We're using those, and we're benefiting from this really great working intact system that's been supporting humans for thousands of years. We both need to act immediately and do more research immediately, which is I am encouraged by the fact that lots of the congratulatory messages to Joe Biden contained the idea of working together on climate change, and I understand why they're saying that, given the incumbent at the moment. But it's great that that's one of the first things that comes out of people's mouths. And so understanding climate change is a priority, taking and digesting the IPBES report and starting to think holistically, research, fund holistically, and actually also pragmatically working out what are the next steps based on what we know now, as well as investing in future research to know better things in the future.
Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
I would certainly agree on the research, but that's because I'm an academic as well, I guess. But my research revolves around this concept that I call resilience through diversity. That by rebuilding biodiversity, by getting predators back into ecosystems, by getting a more natural dynamic and structure within ecosystems, we increase the resilience of that ecosystem to climate change, but also through a diversity of governance approaches. So yes, we do need more research, but in terms of the responses that I hope to see, I'm still trying to be optimistic here. At a UN level, the IPBES report hopefully will encourage some strenuous international negotiations and proposals and measures to reduce these pandemic risks, yes, including political pressure, to reduce the wildlife trade, to reduce wet markets. So we need those top-down structural reforms, but they are driven by people. You know, we live to varying degrees and in various ways. We live in a democratic system. So what happens at the UN is dictated, is very strongly influenced, shall I say, by the people that we elect. So from a bottom-up perspective, yes, I go back to my hope that this long pause, that this corona becomes an opportunity for people to reflect and talk to their family and talk to each other about how we need to change our lifestyles, about how we need to change our aspirations to reduce the risks associated with pandemics, with climate change, to start to realize that these sorts of threats are inextricably intertwined. It's part of a bigger picture, but it is a picture that we can start to repaint.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, thank you both of you. David, do you have anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
I just say, I guess I don't think we can know how much we have an amazing capacity for denial as a species, and I just really hope that we can just grow beyond that. At least maybe younger people have a higher capacity to not fall foul of being protected by denial and have a chance to shift their mindset. This has been a massive wake-up call about the way we're interacting with nature, and I do hope that the desperation to return to normal also has that return to normal. It was with a slightly different mindset. Everything has been shifted, it's been tinted differently, because let's go back, but let's maybe just be a bit more aware about what we're doing, and hopefully that is a part of a gradient that's going to move from this point.
Well, it'll be interesting to look in a year's time as to how this pandemic, what the dialogue in relation to this pandemic has become once the vaccine has hit. So maybe we'll meet in a year's time and talk about this again. Thank you, both of you, so much for talking to me. That has been a really eye-opening conversation. Dr. David Redding and Dr. Peter Jones, thank you very much. That was Dr. David Redding and Dr. Peter Jones. If you'd like to find out a little bit more about Peter or David and what they were talking about, I've included some more information in the show notes. So that brings us to the end of the episode. Next week I'm going to be back exploring the topic of carbon offsetting, which is often considered a little bit controversial. If you're not familiar with the term carbon offsetting, it is essentially, in brief, calculating the amount of carbon emissions that you are responsible for as a company or as an individual, and then offsetting that by funding projects that are reforesting or conserving wildlife and sucking in that amount of carbon dioxide. That's a very, very brief, basic outline of it, and my guest for next week, Lucy Arndt, will be able to explain it in much more detail and all about the pros and the cons and the controversies and the benefits and all of that. In the meantime, there is a whole bank of other episodes that you can listen to if you're feeling a little bit demoralised and depressed after hearing all about the spread of disease and deforestation and destruction of our world and the inevitability of future pandemics. Then I would strongly recommend giving episode 4 of series 1 a listen, Reforesting the Planet with Ecosia, and you can hear all about the uplifting and inspiring work that Ecosia are doing and the reforestation projects they've got around the world that you can help support simply by switching your internet search engine. If you have enjoyed the podcast, please do share it among your friends and your family and click subscribe so you never miss an episode. And feel free to leave a rating or a review online or on whichever platform you are listening to. My name is Tom Ward-Thomas. This is Planet and the People. I am on social media, at Planet and the People on Instagram and Facebook, and at Planet and the P on Twitter. I'm going to wander home now and say goodbye.